We have been a church that has been activated to be in a different form of worship. We've been a church to be activated in service in our communities. We've been activated to respond to God's love in different ways. And for this next phase in response to the pandemic, we are going to continue to be activated in different ways as we begin to gather in person again. And so, again, this is not a measure of open and closed. It's a measure of how do we continue to respond to the moment? How do we respond to the knowledge and information we have? And how do we respond with the resources and abilities that we have to adapt as a congregation going forward? If you have any questions during this presentation, I invite you to please put them into the chat box, and I'll do my best to respond to them in the moment. We will have a time at the end for question and answers to be able to talk about some of the things that you'll hear today as well. Go ahead and hit the next slide there, Ian. Some of the material you're going to hear in this presentation will be similar to what we heard in March, just as important repeat, but a lot of the information will be new. At the beginning, we want to continue to give thanks to God as we did a month ago. We want to give thanks to God for the continued vaccination efforts in our communities, which has now offered protection to many of our congregants who are now fully immunized. I've heard many, many stories from our congregation of people that are now 2 weeks past their second shot. Go ahead and raise your hand on your screen if you have been fully vaccinated as to this point. Yep, and you can see a lot of hands going up on the screen there, and I see a number of smiles that come along with those hands. Yep, so lots to be thankful for. We give thanks to God for those efforts that continue. I give thanks to God that I'm going to be receiving my second shot on Thursday this week. So I'm getting close to that full immunization mark myself. We also give thanks to God for the gatherings and the time together families are now experiencing. I'm hearing a lot of grandparents meeting with grandkids, of people being able to share meals together in their homes or out at restaurants. Those are all things to be celebrating and to be able to give thanks to God for those ways that we're reconnecting with people that matter to us. We continue to give thanks to God for everyone who continues to follow public health protocols. Even though we're celebrating lots of great things, it's a continued reminder that the pandemic is not over and that there continues to be risk of spread in our communities. And so thank you to everyone that continues to wash hands, practice social distancing, and wear masks, even if you have been fully vaccinated. We also give thanks to God for the resilience, grace, and adaptability of our congregation, who for this last year plus have sacrificed in-person worship and other gatherings to limit the spread of COVID-19. And we give thanks even as we know that we sacrificed a second Holy Week and Easter season, being able to do this through online worship. And so lots of things in the midst of this to give thanks to God as we begin. Go ahead and hit the next slide, Ian. And so a few things that we want to recognize are a part of our conversations with the vision team and as a part of our discernment. We recognize that public health measures, as recommended by the CDC, still emphasize that any public gatherings, especially like worship gatherings, utilize social distancing, face masks, and the washing of hands to limit additional risk and spread of the virus among both vaccinated and non-vaccinated populations. We also recognize, again, that fully vaccinated individuals, which is 2 weeks following your second shot or the single shot of the J&J vaccine, that those fully vaccinated individuals can now gather in small groups with other fully vaccinated individuals without masks. And we give thanks to God again for that. What we also recognize, though, at this point in time is that our established congregation of folks that worship and are connected with us is made up of many, many fully vaccinated people, with some who are partially vaccinated and with some non-vaccinated individuals and families. And that is part of our makeup. And we continue to recognize that it's important that everyone get vaccinated to do our part to reduce and hopefully eliminate the risks and transmission of COVID-19 in the future. Go ahead and keep going. We also recognize this new information that continues to emerge. We recognize that vaccination rates in our neighborhood here in Denver and in the broader community are less than our congregation. Our congregation is well north of 50, probably even well north of 70% fully vaccinated, and that's a great thing. But we recognize that our neighborhood and here in Denver, those rates are less because the younger the population, and especially among teens and children, is that those parts of the community are not vaccinated yet at this point. We recognize in this present moment that rates of virus transmission and hospitalizations are increasing in Denver, and that is mostly among the 18 to 40-year-old population. And this is likely due to variant transmission, which is more transmissible and causes more severe disease. And so we recognize that the spread of the virus continues and is increasing at this present moment. But we do recognize that populations that have been fully vaccinated, particularly older adults and vulnerable populations, are not part of the groups that are seeing this increase in transmission. We recognize in other parts of the country that schools and kids and young adult activities are the primary places that transmission rates are being driven, and that lots of outbreak sites are in schools and other school-related activities and in populations of people in and around school-age kids, especially their families. And so where transmission is happening, where there is increase in transmission, is in places where that would make sense based on vaccination rates. So a little bit of background information on where we are currently. Go ahead and keep going, Ian. And then we also recognize this, that despite the increase in infections in the neighborhood and community, the most vulnerable populations of our communities, including seniors, have been given the opportunity for vaccination and are now largely protected, and that is a really good thing. We also recognize that state guidelines as of Friday have now ended. There is no longer a Colorado set of recommendations, that city and county guidelines are now the only measures that we are given, and that those guidelines did loosen further in the city and county of Denver also on Friday. And that our communities and neighborhoods and organizations in and through, not just here in Denver or Colorado, but throughout the country, are moving toward increased in-person gatherings. Go ahead and keep going. And so our vision team, with all of this information, as we consider these points, that we have two main points. One, we still have a responsibility to love our neighbors through the practicing of basic public health measures. That includes washing hands, keeping 6 feet of distance when we're together, and wearing masks. But we also conclude that we do have the capacity to begin planning for safe in-person gatherings for both worship and fellowship within the present guidelines that exist. And it's important for us to start taking steps towards those in-person gatherings that we are already in process of doing, and that we are going to be taking further steps forward out of this presentation today. Go ahead and keep going. And so this is the timeline that we are tentatively operating under as a congregation for what our next steps are looking at. So that we are working towards beginning hybrid in-person and online worship opportunities by the middle of May. That's just about a month from now. And by hybrid, you're going to hear that language from me a lot going forward. It's the language of how do we continue to be a community that worships both in person, and how do we continue to be a community that has accessibility and inclusion through online means. That is not just because of people that may be worried about virus transmission, but it's certainly for all aspects of our congregational life going forward. When we have difficulties with weather, for connecting with folks that may be at home or traveling, for all aspects of incorporating visitors and giving as many access points as possible for a congregation, we, for all intensive purposes, need to be a hybrid worshiping congregation going forward, where there is certainly an in-person community, but that we also continue to expand upon how it is that we connect with people online, both live and through recordings. This next month, so really already beginning through the middle of May, we are going to be doing multiple tests of how these hybrid opportunities will function. And so you will likely start to see my backdrop, the setting where I'm leading worship. even formatting changes in our worship service begin to happen as we experiment and we test these new ways of doing both live online and in-person gatherings. If they appear to be working well, as we hope that they will, and that we find that they will be sustainable for us going forward, we will communicate a start date as soon as we feel confident. And again, that could be as soon as a couple weeks from now that we would give us an actual in-person start date for what that looks like for our congregation. But until we're able to run some tests and get to the point where we feel really comfortable with that, and as we continue to watch transmission rates in the area, we're going to hold off on a specific date today. But again, our timeline is by the middle of May. Finally, we're also prioritizing outdoor worship for in-person until virus transmission rates significantly decline in the broader population. Given that we are a mixed community, given that we do not want to exclude people that have not been vaccinated, we do believe that outdoor worship is the safest form of in-person gatherings until virus transmission rates continue to drop significantly. And so we are looking at beginning our hybrid worship life as having an outdoor worship gathering together with an online component. And that we are working on an alternative for any weather issues if we were to have to deal with rain or extreme heat or wind or other factors, but that we are prioritizing outdoor worship as our lead in-person gathering starting point. Go ahead and go forward, Ian. And I want to emphasize this as we think about hybrid worship, that how we begin our hybrid worship life will not be the final form of what our worship life will look like in the future. We anticipate this to be an adaptable model, something that can change with us in the next months ahead, and that can serve our congregation from the middle of May through early August. And that we're going to be doing a lot of experimenting, we're going to be learning, and that we're going to continue to adapt based on what is continuing to happen with the pandemic. And so we will be experimenting with both the form of our in-person worship and with how our online worship will function long-term through the summer, and that we have a lot to learn based on what it is that we're going to be doing during this season. And that we are targeting the middle to the end of August for us to be prepared for what our long-term worship life is going to look like inside of our building. And that I want to emphasize again, we do not have specific answers today about what part of our building, where in the building, how in the building we hope to be worshiping by the middle to end point of August, but that we are going to be experimenting and working towards what that best option is going to be before we set any of those things into stone. Go ahead and keep going, Ian. And so there continues to be preparation work to get us to the point where we can make this happen a month from now. Is that there continues to be significant building renovations going on. The sanctuary roofing work is almost completed. We're just waiting for end caps to show up. They've been delayed in transit. And so the sanctuary roof, you may not notice that anything has changed, and that is the hope. It's purely been replacing large sections of the tile that had some hail damage, and hopefully the sanctuary roof will look the same as you saw it before. We've also started doing painting work, but unfortunately the current weather conditions have delayed those projects a little bit at this time. We're going to be continuing a lot of our facility work throughout the spring and summer, including the continued adapting of how our space is going to be multi-use with food distribution and other aspects of what our campus has been used for over this last year. And then again, our target for long-term indoor facility use will be August. We also, as we talked about in the last presentation that I'm not going to go back through today, is that we are continuing to determine needs for what in-person worship gatherings are going to need to have in place. And we're continuing to work through the technological needs and investments for online worship. Go ahead and keep going, Ian. And so this is where I want to sort of conclude the presentation today, is to give us an image to think about as we work into these next steps as a congregation. And the question for you all to consider is this, is have you ever moved into a new house? Go ahead and raise your hand if you've ever moved into a new house. How many people like that experience? There's a few people that like that experience. I see a number of other people shaking their heads. Even though we are coming back to the same campus and the same building that we were in a year ago, we have to recognize that the process we're going to be going through in the next months ahead is the same process that anybody goes through when you move into a new house. When you move into a new house, it requires creating a new way of living, right? You have to figure out where things go in the kitchen again, right? Where do the plates go? Where do the cups go? Where are things going to be convenient? What are the things that I need to get that are going to help make this work for me again in the future? And we're going to have to figure out, okay, how do we find both the people and the things that are going to make this new house, this new way of life, work well for us into the future? And that is not simply based on the resources that we have. That is continuing to ask questions around what is going to help us continue to grow and adapt as a congregation so that we can be sustainable and vital into the future. What we are not attempting to do here is to simply get back to doing what we were doing a year ago. But the goal is to continue to adapt, evolve, and to change as a congregation so that we can be well positioned and be vital into the future. And so we're essentially going to be moving into a house that may look familiar, but is going to require a new way of doing things. Now, for anybody that's moved into a new house, when you move things in, there's some things that you do first that work, right? You find the right place for that chair, and that chair never moves again. But for anybody that's moved into a house a few times, you know the first place that you put your toothbrush usually ends up not being the place where that toothbrush ends up being. Is that it worked really well on the counter, but actually I'm going to get something to hold the toothbrush up on the wall, right? We're going to have lots and lots of those moments as a congregation where we're going to try something. It may work for a week and we say, wait, nope, that's not right. Let's try this. And we're going to have a lot of grace, a lot of patience, and a lot of openness to continue to adapt and to continue to work through what those changes are going to be and what our worship life is going to feel like. If you think about the sermon today, right? We talked about Peter being in the boat, fishing where there's no fish. What we're going to be continuing to listen for is Jesus saying, hey guys, CTK, it's time to move to the other side of the boat. And where we're not catching fish, where it's not working, where we need to find something new, we're going to have the courage to continue to move to the other side of the boat. And again, move to the other side of the boat and again, find a new place to fish. Because we're going to have to keep going through that process. So for all of you that may struggle with change, for all of you that have really been longing for something stable, for something that's going to feel like I'm going back to what I found comfort in, we're going to have to work through this together, and that there's going to be lots of moments where this may be really hard. And I want to acknowledge and be honest about that, is that we as a congregation cannot just go back to our old normal, is that we have to keep moving forward into what our new life is going to be. And I'm going to keep walking with you and offering lots of grace and compassion for people that may struggle with that, as will our leadership. And I hope and pray that as you all will walk with one another as we go through that process, as we move into this new house or this new way of being as we go forward. Ian, go ahead and hit that next slide. And so again, I want to go back to the theme of the sermon today, which was questions, right? A lot of our work ahead as a congregation, as we work through this timeline, is about being clear about what questions we are asking. And so one of the key questions that we're asking based out of our core values is, how do we worship in a safe way that all are included? Radical inclusion is a core value. And so as we put these plans together and make it work, we're trying to do this in a safe way that all are included, and we're asking those questions. The second question we're asking is, how do we worship in a meaningful way that all can experience God's presence through liturgy, through prayer, through music, through scripture and sacrament? We're not abandoning the core components of our worship life, but we may need to experiment and work through what is meaningful, what is connective. How do we really create our worship life in the future that it will be meaningful? And how do we ask questions about how do we make it more meaningful for all people? We continue to ask questions about how we are being formed as the church and as disciples for the future of ministry in our world. Is that ultimately, even though we want to be together and to make this happen, that is not necessarily the most important question. The question continues to be, how do we serve our neighbors? How do we continue to be in ministry in a way that is connective and life-transforming for people in the world? And so we are asking those questions in terms of the partnerships and how we utilize our building and what's going to need to happen within our building in the future for the sake of ministry in the world. And then the last piece of this is, how do we care for our congregation, for all of you, and for our community, our neighbors and people around us, in a way that is informed by the communal trauma of this past year? Is that if we just showed up in worship and pretended like nothing happened over this last year, that would be disingenuous to all of the difficulty that we have faced personally and communally, that we as a community have lived through a large-scale trauma. And that really dictates that we respond to others in a way that is informed by how it is that we heal from this type of collective trauma. And so, again, it's really important that we operate thinking through, how do we care, offer that infinite compassion to one another as we walk through this and hopefully heal as a community. And that doesn't just happen all at once or just because we're in person, is that it's going to be a long-term process to heal and to recover and to rise up from this past year. Next slide, Ian. And so those are the questions that we are asking. Here at the end of the presentation, I want to stop and now get your questions. What are the things that you are asking? What are the things that you want to know or that you have input on as we take these steps forward? And so, Ian, if you'll take the slide presentation off, and we will allow people to see one another. And you can go ahead and offer any questions that you may have in the chat, or you can unmute now.